In the winter of 1854, a building went up in Worcester, Massachusetts that would house over 400 people. The cornerstone ceremony drew crowds. Newspapers praised the design. Within 2 years, it held nearly twice its intended capacity. This wasn't unusual. Across America and Europe, similar structures were rising at a pace that outstripped population growth, outstripped documented need, and in many cases, outstripped the availability of trained medical staff to work in them. This is about those buildings. Not the stories we tell about reform and progress, but the physical evidence they left behind. The floor plans, the budgets, the census records, and the patterns that appear when you line them up side by side. The standard story goes like this. The 19th century saw a humanitarian movement to treat mental illness in dedicated facilities rather than jails or poorhouses. Dorothea Dix campaigned for state funding. Reformers designed beautiful campuses. Treatment became scientific. That's all true, as far as it goes. But when you look at the buildings themselves, at how quickly they multiplied and how large they grew, other questions start to surface. Let's start with what we can measure. In 1840, the United States had fewer than 24 institutions specifically for the mentally ill. By 1880, there were over 140. By 1890, that number had nearly doubled again. Some of this tracks with population growth, westward expansion, urbanization. But not all of it. Several states built multiple facilities within a decade of each other. Massachusetts, for instance, opened Worcester in 1833, then Taunton in 1854, then Northampton in 1858. 3 large institutions in 25 years, in a state with a population under 1 million. The buildings themselves tell us something. Worcester was designed for 250 patients. Within 20 years it held over 600. The Willard Asylum in New York, opened in 1869, was built for 1,500. These weren't small operations. The acreage alone is worth noting. Willard sat on 1,800 acres. The Athens Asylum in Ohio occupied 1,000 acres. Danvers in Massachusetts, 900 acres. For context, that's larger than many university campuses today. Why so much land? The official answer was farming. Patients would work the fields as part of their treatment, growing food for the institution, learning skills, staying active. Moral treatment, they called it. Fresh air, meaningful labor, routine. There's documentation supporting this. Asylum reports from the 1850s and 60s regularly mention crop yields, livestock, orchards. The institutions were designed to be self-sufficient. But here's where the numbers get interesting. The amount of land these facilities occupied often exceeded what would be needed for subsistence farming, even for populations of 1,000 or more. Willard's 1,800 acres could have supported a small town. And while some asylums did run productive farms, others had far more acreage than they ever cultivated. Records from several institutions show large portions of land sitting unused, or used for purposes that had nothing to do with patient care or agriculture. Then there's the architecture. If you look at asylum floor plans from this period, certain features appear again and again. Long corridors, sometimes 500 feet or more. High ceilings. Thick walls. Small windows, often barred. Wings that extended out from a central administrative building, creating what's called the Kirkbride Plan, named after Thomas Story Kirkbride, a physician who published influential design guidelines in 1854. Kirkbride's plan was specific. He recommended a linear arrangement with separate wings for men and women, graded housing based on patient condition, and generous square footage per patient. On paper, this sounds humane. In practice, the design created something else. The corridors were too long for efficient staffing. The wings isolated patients from each other and from staff. The central building gave administrators a command post with sight lines down each corridor, but offered little in the way of communal space for patients. And then there's the scale. Kirkbride himself recommended facilities no larger than 250 patients. He argued that larger institutions couldn't provide individualized care. But within a decade of publishing his plan, states were building asylums for 500, 800, 1,200 patients, all using variations of his design. His objections are on record. In 1866 he wrote that large asylums defeated the purpose of moral treatment. By then, it didn't matter. The construction had already begun. So why build them so large? One explanation is cost efficiency. It's cheaper to build one large facility than several small ones. Centralized kitchens, laundries, heating systems, administrative staff. This makes sense from a budget standpoint. But if efficiency was the goal, why build on such remote sites? Many 19th century asylums were located miles from the nearest town, requiring the construction of dedicated rail lines or roads just to access them. The Athens Asylum in Ohio, for instance, required a spur line from the nearest railroad. Danvers was over 20 miles from Boston. This wasn't efficient. It was isolated. The location patterns are consistent enough to be worth examining. Most asylums built between 1850 and 1890 were sited in rural areas, often on high ground, away from population centers. The official reasoning was therapeutic. Clean air, pastoral views, distance from the stresses of urban life. Reformers genuinely believed this. But the effect was to place these institutions beyond the casual oversight of the communities that funded them. There's another detail. Many asylums were built near existing infrastructure that had nothing to do with treatment. Railroads, yes, but also quarries, brickyards, lumber mills. The Willard Asylum sat near several active quarries. So did Danvers. Patients provided labor for on-site construction projects, including the very buildings that would house them. This is documented. Asylum reports from the 1870s and 80s describe patients making bricks, cutting stone, building walls. They called it occupational therapy. How much of the construction was done by patient labor? That's harder to say. Records are incomplete. Some institutions kept detailed logs of patient work assignments. Others didn't. What survives suggests that patient labor was common, but the extent varied. At some asylums, patients built entire wings. At others, they worked on roads, walls, and outbuildings. A few reports mention patients working in nearby quarries or on external contracts. This raises questions about the economic model. If asylums were designed to be self-sufficient, and if patient labor contributed to construction and maintenance, then these institutions weren't just therapeutic communities. They were productive enterprises. They generated value. Not for the patients, obviously, but for the states that funded them. Let's look at the budgets. State asylum funding in the 1860s and 70s was substantial. Massachusetts spent over $200,000 per year on Worcester alone, roughly $5 million in today's money. That's operational costs, not construction. New York's spending on asylums in 1870 exceeded $1 million annually. These were major line items in state budgets, and they were growing. Where did the money go? Salaries, food, heating, maintenance. But also land acquisition, construction, expansion. Almost every asylum built in this period underwent at least one major expansion within 10 years of opening. Worcester added wings in 1843, 1854, and 1877. Utica in New York expanded 4 times between 1843 and 1890. The pattern repeats. Build for 250, expand to 500, expand again to 800. Why the constant expansion? The official explanation is demand. More people needed care, so more beds were added. But the records complicate this. Admission numbers did rise, but not always in proportion to expansions. In several cases, asylums expanded their capacity before they reached full occupancy. Danvers added a wing in 1878 when it was only at 80% capacity. Worcester expanded in 1877 despite having empty beds in existing wings. One possibility is that states were planning for future demand. Population growth was predictable, urbanization was accelerating, maybe they were building ahead of the curve. But that doesn't explain why so many asylums ended up overcrowded despite repeated expansions. If they were building for future demand, why were they consistently undershooting? Another possibility involves the criteria for admission. Who got sent to these places and why? The records show a mix. Some patients had clear diagnoses by the standards of the time: mania, melancholia, dementia. But the records also include vagrancy, intemperance, masturbation, and political excitement. The definitions were broad. Families could commit relatives without much oversight. Towns could commit paupers. Judges could commit criminals deemed insane. This is where the function of these institutions gets murky. Were they hospitals, or were they holding facilities? The design suggests both. Medical wards existed, but so did locked rooms, solitary cells, and restraint equipment. Treatment records from the period describe therapies like hydrotherapy, occupational work, and fresh air. They also describe prolonged isolation, cold baths as punishment, and mechanical restraints used for weeks at a time. There's a gap in the documentation. Many asylums kept admission and discharge records, but detailed treatment records are sparse. We know how many people entered, and we know how many left. We don't always know what happened in between. Some institutions published annual reports with statistics and general descriptions. Others published very little. Patient testimony from the period is rare, and when it exists, it's often dismissed as unreliable. What we do have are architectural records, and these are revealing. Asylums built after 1870 included features that are hard to square with therapeutic intent. High walls around the grounds. Guard towers in some cases. Locked wards with minimal supervision. At the Hudson River State Hospital in New York, completed in 1871, entire wings were designed without staff quarters nearby. Patients could be locked in at night with no attendants on the floor. The staffing ratios are part of this. In 1880, the average asylum had one attendant for every 20 to 30 patients. That's not enough for individualized care. It's barely enough for basic supervision. And the attendants themselves were often untrained. A survey from 1884 found that fewer than 10% of asylum staff had medical training. Most were hired for their physical strength or willingness to work for low wages. So what were these places doing? If they weren't providing meaningful treatment, and they weren't adequately staffed, and they kept expanding despite chronic overcrowding, what was their function? One answer is warehousing. Society needed somewhere to put people it didn't know what to do with. The mentally ill, the elderly, the poor, the difficult. Asylums absorbed them. They took people off the streets, out of jails, away from families who couldn't manage them. But warehousing doesn't explain the farms, the workshops, the labor programs. These institutions were extracting productivity from their populations. Not universally, and not in every case, but enough that it shows up in the records. Asylum farms produced food that was sold commercially. Asylum workshops made goods for outside sale. Patient labor built not just asylum buildings but roads, bridges, and infrastructure that benefited surrounding communities. There are documented cases. The Georgia State Sanitarium, opened in 1842, leased patient labor to local farms. The Louisiana State Asylum ran a profitable sugarcane operation in the 1870s. The Western State Hospital in Virginia operated a brick kiln that sold to the public. These weren't isolated incidents. They weren't scandals that were quickly shut down. They were standard operating procedure. And then there's the involuntary commitment process. In most states, a person could be committed to an asylum on the testimony of 2 citizens, reviewed by a judge. The standard was vague. Insanity had no clear definition. Once committed, patients had little recourse. Discharge required approval from the asylum superintendent, who had discretion to determine when, or if, someone was well enough to leave. How long did people stay? The records vary. Some patients were discharged within months. Others stayed for years or for life. The average length of stay increased over time. In the 1850s, it was measured in months. By the 1880s, many patients were staying for multiple years. Some institutions had patients who had been there for 20, 30, 40 years. The discharge records raised their own questions. Patients were released as cured, improved, unimproved, or deceased. The percentage listed as cured was often surprisingly low, sometimes under 20%. Improved was more common but vague. Unimproved accounted for another significant portion. And then there were the deaths. Mortality rates in 19th century asylums were high, sometimes exceeding 10% per year. Causes included tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, and malnutrition. These were preventable diseases, made worse by overcrowding and poor sanitation. Some asylums had their own cemeteries. Willard Cemetery holds over 5,000 graves. Most are marked only with numbers. Names weren't always recorded. Families often didn't claim bodies, either because they didn't know their relative had died, or because they couldn't afford burial. The graves are still there. Rows and rows of numbered stones, stretching across several acres. This brings us back to the question of intent. Were these institutions designed with multiple purposes in mind from the start? Or did they evolve into something different from what was originally planned? The evidence supports both possibilities. Some reformers genuinely believed in moral treatment and designed asylums accordingly. But the scale and location choices suggest that other considerations were also at play. Economic utility. Social control. A place to put people who didn't fit. The architecture reflects this tension. Beautiful facades, often built in the Gothic or Victorian style, facing the road. High ceilings, ornate details, landscaped grounds. This is what visitors would see. But behind the main building, the patient wings were stark. Narrow rooms, minimal furnishings, barred windows. The contrast is striking. It's as if the buildings were designed to present one thing to the outside world while functioning as something else internally. There's a phrase that appears in asylum literature from this period: moral architecture. The idea was that the building itself could influence behavior, that well-designed spaces promoted calm and recovery. This wasn't just metaphor. Architects and reformers believed it literally. They thought high ceilings prevented agitation. They thought long corridors encouraged exercise. They thought isolation rooms allowed reflection. Whether this worked is debatable. What's clear is that the buildings were also designed for control. The radial layouts of some asylums gave staff sight lines into every wing. The locked wards prevented unauthorized movement. The remote locations made escape difficult. These features served institutional needs more than therapeutic ones. By the 1890s, some reformers were questioning the asylum model. Reports began appearing that documented overcrowding, poor conditions, and low cure rates. Journalists toured facilities and published exposés. Nellie Bly's 1887 undercover investigation of Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York revealed abuse and neglect. Similar reports came from other states. The public was starting to ask what these institutions were actually accomplishing. But the building continued. Even as criticism mounted, new asylums went up. The Pilgrim State Hospital in New York, opened in 1931, would eventually house over 13,000 patients, making it one of the largest psychiatric facilities in the world. The model didn't collapse under scrutiny. It scaled. What we're left with is a system that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of progressive reform. Yes, there was genuine concern for the mentally ill. Yes, conditions in jails and poorhouses were worse. Yes, some patients received treatment that helped them. But the scale, the economics, the labor practices, the architecture of control, all of this points to a more complicated reality. The buildings are still standing. Many have been abandoned, but they haven't been torn down. They're too large, too expensive to demolish. Some have been repurposed. The Danvers State Hospital was partially converted to apartments, though most of it was demolished in 2007. The Athens Asylum is now part of Ohio University. Willard closed in 1995 and sits mostly empty. When you visit these sites, the size is overwhelming. Walking the grounds, you get a sense of what it must have been like to be sent here. The distance from the gate to the main building. The distance from the main building to the patient wings. The walls, the fences, the isolation. These weren't places designed for easy coming and going. The records that survive are incomplete, but they're enough to see patterns. The same design choices appearing across states. The same economic models. The same populations being institutionalized. The same outcomes. High mortality, low discharge rates, chronic overcrowding, and expansion after expansion. What doesn't appear in the records, or appears only obliquely, is the experience of the patients themselves. Their voices are largely absent. We have reports written by superintendents, budgets approved by legislators, architectural plans drawn by builders. But the people who lived in these buildings, who worked the farms, who occupied the cells, left very little behind. A few letters survive. A few testimonies given after discharge. Mostly, there's silence. This makes it difficult to say with certainty what these institutions were. We can describe what they did. We can measure their inputs and outputs. We can trace their expansion and document their operations. But the question of intent, of whether this was planned or emergent, of whether it was reform or something else wearing the mask of reform, that remains open. What we can say is this: between 1850 and 1900, the United States built a vast network of institutions that housed hundreds of thousands of people, extracted labor from many of them, and kept most of them for years or for life. These institutions were expensive to build and maintain, but they also generated economic value. They removed populations that society found difficult or inconvenient. And they did all of this under the banner of treatment and care. The buildings themselves, the ones still standing, continue to raise questions. Why so large? Why so remote? Why so much land? Why the walls, the bars, the isolation? The answers given at the time don't fully satisfy. Moral treatment required large campuses, they said. Self-sufficiency required farms. Security required locks. But when you add it all up, when you look at the scale and the scope, it starts to look like something more than a hospital system. This isn't to say there was a conspiracy. There doesn't need to be. Systems can develop their own logic. Economic incentives align, bureaucracies expand, buildings get built. What starts as reform becomes routine, becomes infrastructure, becomes too big to question. By 1890, asylums were simply part of how society functioned. Every state had them. They employed thousands. They occupied thousands of acres. They were, in their own way, successful. But successful at what? That's the question these buildings still ask. They were supposed to heal people, and some people were healed. They were supposed to provide refuge, and for some they did. But they also confined, isolated, extracted labor, and buried thousands in unmarked graves. The architecture reflects all of this. The beautiful facades and the barred windows. The pastoral campuses and the locked wards. The ideals and the reality. These patterns, these repetitions across dozens of institutions, suggest that whatever was happening in 19th-century asylums wasn't just about individual failures or bad actors. It was structural. It was built into the design, the funding, the laws, the architecture. And because it was structural, it persisted. It scaled. It became normal. The history of these institutions is still being written. New research continues to uncover records, patient testimonies, and documentation of practices that were once routine. What emerges is a picture more complex than either the reform narrative or the scandal narrative can capture. These were places where multiple purposes coexisted, where care and control overlapped, where stated intentions and actual practices often diverged. For anyone interested in how institutions function, how architecture shapes behavior, how economic and social forces drive policy, these buildings offer a case study. They show how systems can develop in ways their creators might not have fully anticipated. They show how ideals can be compromised by practicalities. They show how the vulnerable can be exploited even within systems ostensibly designed to help them. The asylums of the 19th century were built for more than treatment. The evidence is there in the floor plans, the budgets, the labor records, the grave markers. What exactly they were built for remains a matter of interpretation. But that they served multiple purposes, some of which had little to do with healing, seems difficult to dispute. The question isn't whether to believe conspiracy or coincidence. It's whether to look at the evidence and ask what these buildings were really doing. The answers aren't always in the official reports or the dedication speeches. Sometimes they're in the architecture itself, in the distance from the gate to the ward, in the size of the cemetery, in the thickness of the walls.